this is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude, reviewing today the Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser 2.0. A couple things you should know about this. I did not buy it new from Kult of Athena. I bought it secondhand on the Sword Buyer's Guide forum. So this may not be representative of what exactly you would get if you ordered one new. I don't believe the previous owner really used it at all, but I can't say that for sure. Secondly, I don't really know much about what I'm doing with the Kriegsmesser. I am treating it mostly like a longsword, but even then, I am very much self-trained with swords. I don't practice HEMA. I mostly just do cutting, a lot of backyard cutting, a little competitive cutting on tatami, but it's almost exclusively self-trained. So if you see me making stupid mistakes on how to use this, that is probably why. And then, of course, you should know what this sword costs. It is $548 new from Kult of Athena. I believe they also had a blemished version for $20 off, but they are back ordered right now. I suspect that they will be getting more of these made and made available, but the timeline on that is completely up in the air. These are made by LK Chen for Kult of Athena. It is Kult of Athena's design, and LK Chen is working as a contract forge for them. The other big thing you should know is that there's quite a bit of history to this sword and the Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser in general, and I do not want to get into all of that because I've already done so in another video in my review of the first Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser. I will link that review in the description, probably up here on screen as well. And if you want to know more of the history behind it, I highly recommend you go check out that video. It's pretty long, goes into quite a bit of depth. One other thing that you might have heard, not really from me, but just in general, is that after that review of the original, there was some talk about James Elmsley working with Kult of Athena to design another Kriegsmesser for them. If you're not familiar with James Elmsley, he's kind of the authority on medieval single-edge European swords, falchions and Kriegsmessers and messers in general. The typology of these blades was one that he came up with. I'm bringing that up because I wanted to just make sure you're aware, this is not that sword. This is not the one that Elmsley was working with on Kult of Athena. I don't know if that's still happening or not, but I do know for sure, direct from James, that this is not one that he had any design and input into. And since I do have the first Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser, I will be doing a good number of comparisons between it and this one. The first thing I'm going to talk about, though, is the overall design is very, very different. It has a very unique hilt, and this hilt is in the style of Hans Summersberger, and I apologize for my horrible pronunciation there. There are some historic pieces made or designed by him this is very clearly takes inspiration from, especially the bronze bottom half of the grip, the dual tone here. Now, the historical ones had a ton of decoration on them, and that is not apparent on these. That would add a lot of cost and probably put these out of the price range of most buyers. But this is very clearly inspired by those. Let's start off by looking at the scabbard here. This is a wood core scabbard. It's got a nice solid wood core, maybe a bit chunkier than it needs to be. And then these, frankly, really big and chunky metal bits. There's this chape here and then throat here, locket, whatever you want to call it. I believe these are both made of bronze. And they, like I said, they're big and they are heavy. That makes the entire scabbard considerably heavier than I think it really needs to be. And then we also have this really nice decoration put on here. I'm not sure exactly how this is put in. It's not like hand carved or anything like that. And it doesn't really feel like paint either. I'm not sure exactly how that's put in. There's a seam along the back that is nice and straight, well done. The actual stitches are soft and feel good. It is kind of separating in a little bit in a few places, but the stitching helps keep it together. I did mention the The wood core is a little bit chunky for my taste, but it's not terribly so. The biggest problem though is that it just doesn't really fit that great. If I slide it in, it gets stuck right about there. I can kind of jiggle it around. It also sometimes gets stuck there. I can kind of jiggle it around sometimes and get it. I could actually get it all the way in if I just put it, seated it with force, but then it would be hard to get out. In fact, when I first got it, it was all the way in, and it took quite a bit of force to get it out. So unfortunately, the blade just doesn't quite fit right in the scabbard for me in my climate. Now let's take a look at the hilt, and let's kick that off by comparing it to the first iteration of the Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser. The most notable differences between the first Kriegsmesser and the second one. The blades are different too, but the hilt is remarkably different, while still being at least somewhat recognizable as a second version of the first one. First thing I want to talk about is on the 2.0, they have completely encapsulated the tang within the wood grip and then this bronze block here. On the first one, the tang was exposed, and while I don't really have hot spots on mine, it is certainly possible for the tang to stand a little proud over the grip scales and end up being a hot spot. That wasn't an issue for me on this one, but it could be. When you encapsulate the tang like this, that you get rid of that potential problem entirely. Now, obviously the look of these is considerably different, especially in the grip portion. We have this two-tone color to the wood portion, and then we have this big piece of bronze on the end, which is obviously going to affect the balance of the sword considerably. We'll talk about that some more in a little bit. There's also more nuance to the grip shape here. It starts a little bit thinner and swells out towards the hook or the beak, whereas on the original, it is just straight across entirely. The original, I did find that this groove was a little bit deep and was a little bit uncomfortable at times. I don't find that to be the case here. I find the groove is nicely shaped and is comfortable in the hands. The pins do stand proud a little bit, especially this one right here, whereas on the first one, I can feel them, but they don't stand so far out that I can really notice them. This one is quite noticeable, and the transition here is very, very good. The other part that was changed considerably is the noggle. On the original, it's much more curved back. It's still fluted, but it's curved back more. This one has the fluting as well, but it's much straighter, trying to get something that is distinguishable from the Connect, so it's not too similar. One issue I do have with it is they shortened this center block. If you compare the lengths of them, on the second one, it's shorter, and these corners are quite sharp, and they bite into my hand when I'm swinging it, when I'm using it. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it is noticeable that they did definitely shorten it comparatively. The quillin tips are a little bit smaller on the second one, and there's not the rectangular block towards the end of the quillins there like there is on the original. I'm not sure if you can see that in this framing, but I will show it in a close-up. So a couple things that I didn't mention there. The transition from the grip to the bronze pommel is just the slightest bit wonky. It kind of has a part where the wood is a little bit thicker or wider than it needs to be, so it kind of transitions to the pommel a little bit abruptly. It doesn't create a ledge or anything like that. It is definitely smoothed over, but it is a bit of an abrupt transition that looks just a little bit wonky. The fit of the blade to the guard is good. It could be a bit smaller, but it's not bad at all, especially at mid-range price, which at $550 essentially, this is solidly in the mid-range for swords. Now, I mentioned this in my first impressions video, but when I first saw this Kriegsmesser on Kult of Athena, I thought, oh, that that grip looks really interesting with the two tones of the wood. And I was really looking forward to seeing it when I got it. Unfortunately, when I got it, I realized it's paint, and it just doesn't look good to me. It looks fine from afar, but when you get close, it's very obviously just paint. And I don't know, it looks modern, and it doesn't really appeal to the way I want it to appeal to my aesthetic taste. It looks cheap and tacky to me. I think this would look a lot better if I just sanded off or stripped off this paint and just let the bare wood shine through. I think if there was a desire to go for a two-tone, which is a good idea, I think that fits with this look, it would be better to have either use stain on the wood rather than paint, although I think that would be a little tricky to do that, or to use multiple types of wood, which would be tricky as well, frankly. So I can see why they did it. I just don't like the result. So it leaves something to be desired, in my opinion. And I mentioned this a bit ago, but these blocks at the where the quillant comes out, these are quite sharp, and they are perfectly positioned to rub against my fingers. When I was cutting with this sword, they absolutely made themselves known to me, and my fingers I actually had some sores on my pointer finger after cutting with it because I kept on hitting, those corners interacted with my finger and were unpleasant. That's something I definitely feel like should be improved either by extending that block out a little bit so it's not right where my finger rests, or taking a file and just smoothing over that corner a little bit. It would reduce the exactness of the square, but I don't actually think that's a problem. It doesn't look great to me as a square end there. I think having it be a more gradual transition into this writhtening of the guard, I think that would look better anyway. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As usual, here's my measurements. And for good measure, I will transition between the measurements for this one and the first version, which I do have a graphic of. So you can kind of get an idea of how they differ in the little nitty-gritty details. This one weighs in at just over 3 pounds. The first one at 2 pounds, 11 ounces, somewhere right around there. This one, despite being heavier, is balanced closer to the hilt because it's got that big honkin' weight on the end of it in that bronze pommel. And there is a ton of distal taper on this Kriegsmesser. It starts at 7 millimeters thick, has quite a bit of distal taper in the first foot or so of the blade, slows down a little bit, and then gets very, very thin out towards the tip. Around 2 millimeters, if I'm remembering right. That is a lot of distal taper. That leads to a sword that has a lot more weight towards the base of the blade and not much out here in the cutting, which makes for a sword that has very good geometry for cutting and also brings the point of balance back, as I already mentioned. So looking at the blade, it's gorgeous. I love the blade on this Kriegsmesser. I think it has the perfect amount of curve, the perfect width. You know, it has quite a bit of profile taper as well, but it stays wide enough to make for good cutting geometry. And it just looks great. I love that there is a false edge here that is ground in very nicely. The fuller is very well done. The fuller doesn't end at exactly the same point on both sides, but it's pretty close. And overall, it's just a really, really attractive sword blade, in my opinion. In addition, LK Chen does this phenomenally. The edge beveling is perfect. It's a smooth bevel from the start of the bevel, pretty much at the end of the fuller, all the way to the edge, or here at the end of the false edge, all the way to the edge. It's really clean. There's no secondary bevel here, and it is also very, very sharp. We'll get to that in just a minute. And if I look down the lengths of the blade, looking at the planes, there is definitely some rippling. There's not a crazy amount. It's very minor rippling, but it is there. And in the fuller, it's a little bit more noticeable than on the flats of the blade, but we're not talking very much rippling here. It's quite even and well done. The polish is a satin, and it's pretty good. It could be better. There's a spot right here where it's shinier than the rest of the blade. I'm not sure if that could actually be from the previous owner, if maybe there was some scuffing there or maybe a tiny bit of rust or something. He polished it out. I don't know. But it is there, and I noticed it, so I'm going to bring it up. But overall, the finish is pretty even, pretty smooth throughout, and it's just a very attractive sword. And comparing the blades now, there are some definite changes, but also some similarities. The biggest change is that the blade on the new one, has a considerably more profile taper. It gets a lot narrower out towards the tip. It's also a good 2 inches longer or so. And then it also has a false edge with a clearly defined bevel there, whereas the first one did not have a false edge at all. And really, that's about it. The fuller length is almost the same. And when you compare the overall look of the swords, I think there's a lot of distinguishing features of the second version. And there's pretty much no way, in my opinion, it could now be considered to be a clone of the Connect. It has definitely moved far enough away from that to be its own thing entirely. All right, let's see how sharp the edge is. So it kind of struggled to cut out here past where you really want to cut with the sword actually, but once I got to the sweet spot, it sliced through very easily. And yeah, I think that initial struggle was actually just me not keeping the paper fully straight, because it is sharp enough out there very nicely. Let's test the false edge here. So it did slice paper there quite well, but not as well as the primary edge. It's definitely not as sharp there as it is on the true edge. And that definitely is my experience cutting with the sword as well. I did try some false edge cuts. I couldn't really get a single clean cut. Now, my false edge technique is pretty shit, frankly, but I usually can get at least through them. I got one where I did a right Zwerkow. I don't even know if that's the correct terminology for Messer technique, but I'm going with longsword technique because it's what I know. And I got through it, but it was a very ugly cut, and it did more bashing than it did cutting, and it tore the bottle more than it cut. I tried a false edge ascending, and I threw the bottle out of the yard. I tried a false edge descending, that was kind of a Shielhao, and it didn't really get through very much. So the false edge, for me, I just couldn't really get a good cut with it. But when I went to the true edge, did this sword cut nicely. I got some silent cuts. I got a zero distance cut that just went through with no issue at all. Lots of clean, easy cutting. This sword is very sharp, and it is very good at backyard cutting. I didn't do any tatami with it, but my hunch is it would slice through tatami very nicely if you're so inclined. But just for backyard cutting, especially if you just want to do water bottles, is this ever a good sword for that? Okay, handling. So the first thing when I pick up this sword, every time, I'm like, wow, there's a good amount of weight back here, because this bronze piece adds a lot of weight to the sword. And I immediately notice that. I pick it up, I'm like, there's a lot of weight in this hilt. It is a long blade at almost 36 inches long. With all that distal taper, it is a pretty flexible blade, especially for a single-handed sword, but not overly flexible. And you can see it really only flexes in the last 2/3 or so. The base stays nice and rigid, which makes sense because it is quite thick there. It starts at 7 millimeters thick. The center of percussion, it's a little hard to tell, but it's right around where the fuller ends, and then there's about an inch, and then the false edge begins, and it's right in that area where the center of percussion is. That's a really good spot for the center of percussion. That's a good place for the sweet spot. And the sword happens to be very, very sharp there as well, which is a nice bonus. It's also balanced very close to the hilt at around just over 2 inches, right at the B of the Balaur arms mark. That is for a almost 36-inch blade. That's a very close point of balance. And that pommel is a huge part of the reason why. It's a big counterweight on this sword, and it makes this sword very agile. It's just over 3 pounds, so it's not a particularly light sword. It's not a particularly heavy sword either, but it is incredibly quick because there's so much weight back here. You can accelerate the tip very quickly and very easily. It has a ton of control, and it is very easy to move it around. The tip goes right where I want it. You can see I'm doing a lot of this one-handed. This sword works one-handed very, very well. It's a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit heavy for a one-handed sword. I don't like when they get over 3 pounds, but it is still very nimble and very usable in one hand. And in two, it just comes alive very, very quick. You can easily redirect a cut. You can start a cut and then move into another. You saw during cutting, I did one where I thrust and then quickly transitioned into a Unterhau, and it went very easily. My extraction on that wasn't very good, but it is nimble enough to handle those very quick movements very, very well. Even just moving it around here, though, this block is really bothers my finger. Every time I move it around, I'm feeling that. To avoid that, I would need to choke down just a little bit, and it doesn't feel right for me to choke down there. The grip gets a little bit wider as it's going towards the pommel, and if I hold it there, it feels a little bit too wide for my hand. I can twist the sword a little bit more than I like if I'm holding it there, whereas if I choke up, I can't twist the sword at all. It's the perfect width right here for my hand. But unfortunately, don't know how well you'll be able to see, that block there digs into my finger every time I move the sword. And then this side can also dig into my thumb a little bit. So really, to be able to make this sword more comfortable to use, I really do need to take a file and file that down. I haven't done that yet because I wanted to leave it pristine for the review, but it is definitely something I think I'm going to need to do. Now, in my Gunther review just 2 weeks ago, I had something fairly similar, although it was part of the Noggle that did that, but that was a little bit of discomfort. This is actual, I think discomfort is even too strong of a word for the Gunther. It made me aware of the corner here. Here, this one is a little bit beyond discomfort. It's starting to feel a little bit painful. It's not horrible, but if I cut with this for particularly long, I start developing a sore on my finger pretty quickly. So it is something that is problematic with this. I mentioned earlier that the pins stick out a little bit, especially this one right here. Doesn't cause any issues for me. I mean, it's in the good thing is the most prominent one is where my palm goes, so it's not going to interact with my fingers there. This one is a little bit rough, but I don't notice it when I'm cutting at all. It doesn't interact with my fingers and cause any discomfort. The bronze part, I was afraid this was going to be uncomfortable to hold, but it's not. It is chamfered over very, very nicely. There's no hot spots on it at all. And the transition here, although I mentioned it's a little bit wonky in terms of how quickly it transitions, the actual joints are perfect. The seam there is not, I don't notice it at all. It works very, very well. And then when I go ahead and pick up the first one, the first thing I notice, this is a considerably lighter sword, but there's a lot less weight in the hilt. I feel more weight out in the tip, but it's also definitely lighter. Let's see if I can get a good comparison shot here. Hope that gets in frame. They are relatively similar blades. This is definitely longer and narrower with a little bit more curve. But let me put this down and I'll tell you how this one feels in comparison. So like I said, the first thing I noticed with this is it is lighter. It has a slightly more forward point of balance, and I can feel that a little bit more weight out here, which makes sense. It's got a broader blade out here. I don't think it has quite as much distal taper to my eye, and overall it's a little bit lighter, so it does feel a little bit, I don't know if I would say quicker. I definitely feel that weight out towards the tip a little bit more, but it doesn't feel slow by any means. This is 2 pounds, 11 and a half ounces, right around there. A very light sword for a two-hander and very usable one-handed. What I will say though is the fact that this has just that perfectly straight grip. I do notice it kind of rubs my hand, the flub of my hand right here a little bit when I'm cutting with it, especially if I do one-handed. It aggravates the palm a little bit, whereas in two, it's just a little bit, not too bad. The 2.0, no problem with that at all. The more refined shape of the grip helps there. But yeah, this feels about the same in terms of agility, maybe a touch more. There's definitely a little bit more blade presence, but just maybe a touch slower because of that blade presence. But it also makes it feel like it's going to do a little bit more of the work for you in the cut. Yeah, when I picked this up, man, do I feel this weight here. Not in a bad way. It just is like, wow, there's a lot of weight in this hilt. And not very much weight out here. It is incredibly light and easy to accelerate the tip, easy to stop the cut. Also, it doesn't feel like it's jarring my elbows or shoulders or anything like that to just cut into long point. Whereas the 1.0, it definitely feels like I need to put a little bit more effort into stopping the cut like that. But yeah, I don't really feel the extra length on this. It's got a few inches on the 1.0, and oftentimes you'll feel more weight out in the tip because of that. Not the case here. That counterbalance is just too much. So let's talk bottom line. This sword retails for basically $550. That puts it solidly mid-range, and there's not a whole lot of competitors out there. You don't see very many Kriegsmessers available. There's the cold steel one, which is the first iteration of the Balaur Arms Kriegsmesser, and I don't want to get into that. And then you can sometimes, like, I think Pavel Mach makes some, but there's not a lot of Kriegsmessers available anywhere, frankly. So if you want a Kriegsmesser, this is one of the very few options that is readily available. At $550, like I said, that does put it in solidly mid-range. Is it worth that price? Yes and no. I have some reservations here. One thing I did forget to mention when I was talking about the hilt is the peen of the nail. It is quite small. If you look at the first version, that one was circular or cylindrical, and Matthew Jensen pointed out how it started twisting on his very easily, and he suggested they key the slot, make it so it doesn't twist around. Well, they did that. This is a square bean, but it's still quite small. And in comparison, here's the Landsknecht Emporium Gunther that I just reviewed recently, and you can see the difference in those beans. The Gunther is much, much more robust, and I would like to see that here. But that's a relatively minor one. The real issues I have with this are this paint. It's awful. I don't like it at all. And then this block, I don't really like that block there much at all. It really does bother my fingers when I'm cutting with it. And there's little aesthetic things. There's a lot of things that I like about the sword. The blade is phenomenal. The hilt could be a little bit better, but it's not terrible. That's for sure. And it's, like I said, it's one of the only Kriegsmessers you can get in this price range, or frankly, without going fully custom. So there's a lot to like about it. It's a phenomenal cutter. It moves very well. It does feel overall solidly constructed. So yes, it's worth the $550, But to me, it feels like I'd be paying $550 for something that I need to work on to make it better. I need to file down these corners. I would really like to remove this paint. And I don't feel like at $550 I should need to do that. So while I do think the function is good enough, the form is lacking just a little bit. But it's still a really, really good sword. And I do really like using it with those small caveats. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you for watching. Until next time, Alien Toot out.